Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for yet another RVC community webinar series. Today we have, sorry for making everyone wait, I'm glad that you all are at the edge of your seats to start this conversation. Today we have my colleagues at the Rockies Venture Club, of course, as well as Jennifer Jones from Colorado Bioscience Association, and we're gearing up for a Life Sciences Investor Forum next week and wanted to talk a little bit more about the world of life sciences investing, what might be similar from other investments, what might set this kind of industry apart. So with that, I'll kick it over to Peter to get us going.
Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that. So just confirming, can everybody see my slides up on the screen? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to introduce Jennifer in just a sec, but just a quick thing about RVC. Most of you know we're a nonprofit organization. We've got about 200 angel investors actively investing in great deals. And for today, about 35% of those deals are life science type deals. So we syndicate with partners all throughout the US. But I do want to talk about this RVC and Colorado Bioscience Life Science Angel Group. So we have been doing events with the Colorado Bioscience Association for, at least 8 years. The Colorado Life Science Night, usually in every February, and just lots and lots of great things. This is a wonderful organization. And so we've partnered up to create this angel investing group focusing on great Colorado deals, but also some not Colorado deals, which you'll see a little bit later when Dave gives his segment. So this group meets periodically. We look at just life science deals. We have a lot of people with expertise in this space. So we have smart people who can bring their actual experience from the field into our investments. But you don't have to be a life science expert. This is a great place to learn. So a lot of people who come in and they think they want to invest in what they know, and they start seeing some of these life science deals and they see smart people evaluating them and doing due diligence, and they get the confidence to jump in as well. So when we talk about life sciences, I'll just say for this discussion, some life science stuff we invest in doesn't actually have life in it, like digital healthcare, for example. So we think about it broadly, like drug, diagnostic, medical devices. We do a lot of that in digital healthcare. And again, this is a popular area, not just in Colorado for investment, but nationwide. So we have syndication partners across the US. So with that, I wanted to toss it over to Jennifer, and maybe you could introduce CBSA and talk a little bit about what you're doing.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to the RVC team, Dave and Emily. Appreciate the partnership. Just say a few words. I'm Jennifer Jones-Payton, President and CEO of the Colorado Bioscience Association, and truly just proud to partner with RVC on these types of events and just the overall partnership driving capital to the life sciences community in Colorado. Colorado Bioscience Association at the very highest level is a trade association that represents life sciences in the state of Colorado. So that's medical device, diagnostic, biotech, pharma, digital health, and ag bio. And really main mission is to grow the life sciences ecosystem here and for us to support all of our companies and member needs. And so yes, you might, don't need to tell you all this, but you might guess that access to capital and capital is, I would venture to say, the top priority for so many of our members. And so this partnership is so important, and appreciate RVC, Peter, you and your team that you do and how you've been working with us over the past 8+ years. So thank you.
And thanks to you. So
yep.
Great stuff. And so here's what we've got for this time period. I have some introductory slides, sort of myth busting about life science investing. And I put these together because I've heard so many times, oops, little ad for pandemic hyperaccelerator. Sorry about that. Here we go. So there's a lot of myths about life science investing, and a lot of people are afraid of it. And I just want to talk through some of that to sort of demystify this, because there's a lot of opportunity and angels do have a space here. But some of these things here, people say it's not for angel investors, it's too big, it takes too long, FDA approvals is too uncertain and takes forever and too expensive. Costs $1 billion to exit deals, takes 20 years to get through, and selling to doctors and medical systems is hard. There's little elements of truth to some of those things, but we have to put them in perspective, because for angel investors, this is actually an area with a lot of promise, and we can see the types of risks, rewards, timelines, and capital needs that we see for any tech or SaaS, type of deal. So it's not quite as scary of a place once you sort of dig in and look at what the investment timelines look like. So just a little bit of myth busting as we go through. So I will go through a bit of this, and then I'm going to shift over to Dave Harris, and he's going to talk about some of the portfolio companies that we have invested in, just to give you some perspective of how these companies have worked out and what we were looking for and what these companies are doing, kind of give a little bit of context. So with that being said, I just want to start with the FDA thing, because this is the big bugaboo and everybody's afraid of FDA. And I think companies that are pitching do well to have a regulatory slide to just talk about what their regulatory strategy is, because this is an area where if it's not talked about when somebody's presenting, then of course investors will fear the worst. So it's a good idea to just sort of be upfront about that and have a strategy. So not all FDA approvals take a long time. So we're all thinking about, right now we're looking at vaccines for COVID and how that's being fast-tracked and how the FDA is having tremendous pressure. And, frankly, to get a drug put through in, within a 1-year timeline is almost unheard of. But there's lots of different types of things that happen. So there's like 5 different types of drugs. There's 3 classes of medical devices. And, they range from a toothbrush or a bedpan, which is a FDA regulated thing, but basically those FDA class 1 medical devices are nothing more than just filing and registering. There's no sort of testing or whatever. And then phase 2 or class 2, medical devices are something we look at a lot. And so those do have some regulatory, but it's really quite a bit easier to get those approved. And then say a class 3 medical device might be like a pacemaker, and obviously those are going to be much more complex and have a longer approval period. There is just quickly something called predicates, where if there's other technologies that have already been approved, then you only have to, overcome the hurdles for the novel aspects of it. You don't have to go back to ground level. So these are other things as we're looking at the risk profile for companies. If there are existing predicates, then that will also reduce the time and cost to approval. The other thing a lot of people don't understand is that we don't have to have, say, a drug on the market in order for us to have an exit as angel investors. In fact, angel investors almost never follow a drug all the way through. There are trends about whether exits are going to happen typically after, say, a phase 1 clinical trial or a phase 2. And I've just read an article recently that it is, moving later and later in some cases. But there's a lot of exit ramps, and it depends on the market and the product and the drug. But a lot of times, if we can just get through a phase 1 trial, that's all we need as angels to go ahead and get bought out. Let's see. Oh, and then just the final thing, we've done 2 deals at RVC where we have they're drug deals, but they're repurposing of drugs as opposed to creating a novel drug. So we already know that these drugs are safe, and all we have to prove is efficacy of these drugs for the claimed results. So those are ways that we can even do drug deals, stay with it all the way to exit, but it doesn't take that long. And I'll just say, one of those, it probably took about 3 or 4 years, but now it's just going gangbusters and they're selling a ton. So good outcomes. I'm looking, by the way, at the screen, and I see lots of people who have lots of experience in this. And so I'm just going to pause for a second to say this is an RVC webinar. So if you have things to add, I'll just invite you to jump in and interrupt, because I'm not fully comprehensive in this. Somebody could talk for hours and hours about FDA regulatory strategies. What I'm hoping to accomplish here is just, to get the high level, to give an overview of some of the demystification of life science investing. But if there is something that you just feel like you've got to share on any of these topics, feel free to jump in. The second thing here I want to talk about is intellectual property. And there's been a lot of debate over recent years about changes in patent law and how patents apply to, say, software type investments. And so we have moved away from looking at patents as an important part of software investments, as SaaS, in SaaS companies, but it is absolutely critical for life science companies. And there's just a few things to think about here. And one is, of course, that patents should be applied for before raising capital. If you're out there raising capital, pitching to people, revealing this technology, A, it's a risk, and B, you can harm your chances of actually getting those patents by having revealed all of that through the process. So even filing a provisional, which you could do for very little money, very little time, is a way to get that stake in the sand so that you're protected as you move ahead. So it's very scary when we see people who have not done that. And then, of course, it's been very difficult to raise money because you've got this black box and you can't really even talk about it, and yet you want people to invest in it. It's not really a realistic scenario. The other thing I hear from some people is that startups, especially angel-backed startups, could never defend their patents because it costs, millions of dollars in some cases to take action against people who are infringing on your patents. And I think that's a bit of a bugaboo. We actually have had companies who come through RVC who have sued major incumbents in the industry and won. So the David and Goliath issue is something that we have seen several times, and the small companies have been able to win even without spending huge amounts on that defense. But really, when we're talking about patents, we're thinking about the value of those patents and that patent portfolio to the acquirer. And so our goal, of course, is always to be exit oriented. And so we're thinking about, obviously a major company acquiring this company who would have the ability to really go and get any infringers as the full extent of the law. Final thing is there is a little known insurance you can buy, which is patent prosecution insurance. And so if you do have people who are infringing on patents, you can draw on this insurance to pay for the legal cost of defending your patent. So one thing we talk about a lot at RVC is capital strategies and how it's so important for people who are raising money and for investors to think about what the capital stack is going to be and how there are going to be subsequent raises building one on top of the other. And in life science companies, we have different inflections of value or different inflections of risk than we would for, say, a typical tech company. So it's important when doing life science investing to think about those, where once we've had risk go down and down and down, we have value going up and up and up. So there are certain times within an organization's life cycle that are very good or very smart times to go out and get investment. And it's important to think about the amount that's raised for each investment and then the obstacles that have to be overcome. So for example, if you're working on a medical device, you probably have say it's a class 2 device, you probably have a milestone of achieving that FDA approval. Once that happens, the valuation of the company, rises significantly. And, you do a larger raise then where you're going to start either manufacturing or working on partnerships or distribution or even moving towards exit. So thinking about how that happens and how much it's going to cost to actually achieve that. And we've had companies at RVC who they only raise enough so that if absolutely everything goes perfectly in that FDA process, then they can afford to pay for that. And when things come up that maybe were unanticipated and there have to be changes in design or whatever it may be, then they find themselves not having achieved those milestones, and then not having created an inflection of value, and then having very hard time raising additional capital to make that additional jump. And I'll just say, sometimes companies will come to us and they'll say, oh, we just need 500K. It's just a bridge, no big deal. Let's do that. And you should know that when investors hear the term, it's just a bridge, that's actually a term of extraordinary risk. It means that there was not sufficient planning or not sufficient risk analysis in thinking about the capital stack strategy. So this is a super important part of life science investing, to make sure you have enough capital to overcome any of those unanticipated risks. Oh, and I'll just say a couple of things. So FDA is one of the key approval by phase. That's a big risk inflection point, but also starting to sell, getting certain distribution agreements, all of those are good risk inflection points. All right, exit strategies for life science companies. This is super important. There are early exit options for life science companies. And so, you know, there's always this difficult balance of, do I go as far as I can to create as much value and get as big of an exit as possible? Or do I get to those, you know, sufficient exit or sufficient inflections of value where now a company could acquire us, and then they can commercialize it and make it go much more quickly than we could. So there are a lot of off-ramp options, and this is something that the boards of startups, the investors, and of course the founders need to work on together and be aligned on, so they understand where those off-ramps are and what the greatest value inflection points are that make sense. Because time is risk. The longer you are running and growing bigger and bigger, you know, things can happen, good and bad, along the way. So it's a matter of weighing those risks. Early on, it's great for life science companies to identify those people who would be potential acquirers and create relationships through maybe sales or distribution partnerships. The other thing I've noticed, I'm kind of a market watcher on these things, is you know, if you're reading these articles in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, you'll see sometimes the biotech market, you know, is just skyrocketing. Everybody loves it. There's lots of deals. IPOs are happening. Good things are happening. Other times we've seen just the opposite. The whole industry is getting beaten down in the news. You know, nobody is going public. Nobody's getting acquired, and it can be really tough. So just as an industry, it does go up and down, and just being aware of that and thinking about those large acquirers who would be acquiring you, if they are seeing that they have ready access to cash, their stock is doing great, it makes sense for them to acquire you, and they'd be likely to do so. But if they're being battered down, no chances for liquidity, then it can be a hard time for exit. So looking at that industry who tends to have these big swings is a smart idea. And if you think about it from the from the point of view of the CFO and CEO of these companies who might acquire, you know, they're getting, say, you know, their stock price is maybe 22 times earnings. So if they can see your company as a way, you know, they might pay, you know, 5 times earnings, 10 times earnings at the most to have an exit, you know, they can do very well in terms of building value for their company. Speaking of valuation, with life science companies, we are rarely valuing companies based on revenue, because most of the risk inflection points for angel investors are going to be way in the pre-revenue side of things. And when we will look at where angel investors get involved in deals, if it's a tech deal, we're typically in revenue or on the cusp of revenue. But in a life science deal, where our risk inflection points are going to be less about sales and marketing and more about technology and regulatory. So we're going to look at comps. We're going to look at other companies where they are when they have made, you know, Series A, Series B rounds, and we'll look at all of those things. We're going to value based on team, people who have been through this before, the technology, and of course the traction in achieving development of the product. So these are all important things that go into valuation. Those of you who work with RVC, you know we have 5 different valuation methods, and none of those are based on revenue. Here's one that has come up recently in a deal that we were evaluating, and it's one of the ones Dave's going to talk to you about in a second. And that is, if you think about marketing of medical products, it's super expensive, super difficult to break into hospitals, healthcare centers, doctors. They are hard to sell to. And these are relationship-based things, and you're selling to people who are super busy, and it can be really hard. The other thing is that if you think about it, your acquirer has already created those relationships. They have already created those channels. So when you're thinking about exits, it's very different how you would exit and think about marketing strategies for a life science company than you would for a SaaS company. For SaaS companies, you typically want to build up as much revenue as you can, and then you're going to exit for, on average, maybe 5x that revenue number. But if you spend years and years and years developing markets, millions of dollars, selling to these doctors and developing those channels, well, probably the first thing somebody who acquires you is going to do is fire all those sales reps, because the value that an acquirer can bring is to plug your product into their channels and co-brand with their markets or their products and so on. So think about why somebody acquires you and where is your biggest value point? Is it in the product and regulatory approved product, or is it in having 25, 50, $100 million a year in sales? And so this deal Dave's going to tell you about, they basically in their pro forma, they did show a little bit of revenue, but that was really just to validate that people would buy this, and it was a good product. But the sale and the value upon sale at exit was not based on revenue at all. All right, so just a quick thing on team considerations. One thing that scares investors a lot is an all academic team. And we see a lot of these teams coming out of universities, and they have cool technology, but really are not quite up to thinking about how to create enterprise value with that technology. So having that experience is really important. And I'll just say, I see a lot of CEOs who are first-time CEOs who can wing it in a technology type company. It's a lot harder to wing it in life science businesses. Life science businesses have a lot of different rules and things that you need to know, and relationships, and there's a lot going on there that having that experience is really important. And just one last thing about team is, the ramp of value creation is not a straight ramp like it might be in a tech company. You might submit something for FDA approval, and you might be waiting 6 months or longer before you can move to the next step. So thinking about who are you going to bring on as salaried employees, and how are you going to pay for those lean periods in between. And then last but not least, a super important good thing about life science companies is there are a lot of grants and non-dilutive funding available. And if you think about it, a lot of the deals we look at that are early stage are SBIR funded. And so the SBIR, I love this slide, they call it the America's Seed Fund. So they are de-risking mostly the technologies early on. And it's a great strategy for life science companies to use that funding, get things de-risked, and move them along. Also, of course, in Colorado, we've got the OEDIT grants, which are an awesome bump. So that's an extra up to $250,000, and a lot of RVC companies have done that. And I just want to do a special shout out to Jennifer and Colorado Bioscience Association, because you guys work so closely with OEDIT and have created a chunk of those OEDIT advanced industry grants that are dedicated just to biosciences. And so this is a really strong program for us to use. So with that, I'll pause for a second to see if there's any questions or comments, or Jennifer, if you have anything you want to jump in on, and then at that point we'll pass it on to Dave Harris, who will talk about some of our portfolio companies.
Peter, if I may, this is Sibylla. I have one question for you, and I really like what you presented. It's really interesting. What databases would you recommend to portfolio companies to use for comps? So obviously not everybody has access to Pitchbook, which is what unfortunately VCs are using. But what would you recommend?
Well, I hate to say it, but I do recommend Pitchbook. I don't recommend paying $24,000 a year for it. But there are consultants you can, pay to have their access to it, or some VCs will allow you access. It is the most comprehensive, I think. Crunchbase tends to be, more tech oriented, but they do have some good data in there, and you can get the Crunchbase Pro subscription for like $29 a month, which is a fairly reasonable investment to get at that kind of thing. But those are really the places that I know about. I don't know if anybody else has other good sources. This is a perennial challenge. So great question.
Yeah. Do you have access to Pitchbook?
We did last year, but it's just it's kind of the budget of our nonprofit.
Correct. Let's talk about this offline. Thank you.
Great, like that. All right. In that case, I'm going to toss it over to Dave, and he can pick up on some of the portfolio companies and give you an idea of the types of things we look at and what we're thinking about.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Peter. So yeah, these are just a few examples. I don't know if Peter mentioned this at the beginning, but across our RVC portfolio and the portfolio of our first fund, life science companies make up a little more than a third of what we invest in. So there's a lot of examples to point to. I pulled out three in particular, and these are three that are some of our more recent investments. For one, where there's actually been an announcement that the round is closed. But they also are unique in what they're offering and what they're creating in their technology, yet they share a lot of commonalities as to why investors gravitated towards them and why they made a viable investment. And they're pretty emblematic of the strategy approach that Peter talked through with each of those different components. So the first one I bring up, and by the way, a number of you on the call are investors in these companies. So if there are things that maybe I don't call out that stood out to you when you decided to invest, feel free to chime in as we're going along. So the first one is Spinal Lines, and this is a company based out of Baltimore. It's an investment deal that RVC led this year, and then it involved co-investment from a number of other angel groups and funds from around the country. So it was kind of an interesting pandemic experience of never actually meeting the company in person, but we all got comfortable and excited about the investment, and there it was. But what they're working on is addressing a problem that spinal surgeons have when they're working on fixing a spinal deformity. So if you're dealing with scoliosis, for instance, so spinal surgeons have to use these rods and screws to effectively bend the spine back into a normal shape. And then during that surgery, they have to make a lot of precise measurements to make sure the spine's properly aligned. And to do that, they now use these 2D X-rays as a guide, and that provides a really limited field of view. So as a result, these surgeries are really complicated, and almost 70% of those patients have some kind of misalignment post-operation, and then about 25% have to have another surgery. So Spinal Lines really doing is they've developed a solution to provide a spinal visualization and assessment platform. And so that provides these 3D assessments in real time of the spine that's minimally disruptive to the surgeon, to the actual performance of the surgery. So it's an enhancement of something that's existing today. So a couple things that just stood out about this deal. For one, Peter talks about exit strategy. In this case, this is one that folks gravitated to because it was an early exit. Without sharing too much detail, their intention is that they will exit possibly within 18 to 24 months, and that would be quite early for an angel investment. They have no intention of going to sell the product, so this is the deal that Peter had referenced on his marketing slide. But they're positioning themselves so that an acquirer could really feasibly sell this right out of the gate. So post-approval, they intend on exploring a sale. So that was attractive to folks in the group. It was both a sophisticated strategy that made sense, but it was also fairly early. And so there's something exciting about that to folks that maybe liked coming in at one point and off-ramping, only a couple of years down the road. The other thing is their regulatory path was fairly clear. Peter talked about predicates; those exist here, and then they're also leveraging existing equipment. And so this kind of again came into positioning the company for when they're ready to be acquired and ready to be sold, as when the technology is ready to be sold. There's equipment that's in the operating room that surgeons are already using, and Spinal Lines technology can effectively fit right into that. So it wasn't a huge capital equipment cost to be expected, and that provided some friction mitigation and made investors comfortable. And then the last thing here, just the malleability of the founder and the team. So VCs often talk about coachability. We always like to have coachability as a factor in founder. I personally don't like that term. I think I don't know, it's demeaning in some ways. I think of it more as like malleability. Are they malleable? Will they, adjust based on feedback that they're getting where valuable? And in this case, we had a founder and a team that was really malleable and really willing to work with investors and really see the due diligence process as a way to add value to the company and not just some painstaking thing to go through. So in this case, we formed a board for the company. There's a lot of support that's going to be provided to them after the fact, but the fact that they were able to be very willing to negotiate and flexible on certain components, that made a big impact to investors. And I think it was part of the reason that ultimately this funding round was well oversubscribed. And again, this was completely during the pandemic. So, kind of an interesting just case study in fundraising in 2020. So for the next company, if you want to go to the next slide, this is one that for folks on the call from Colorado know this company probably well, a company called PharmaJet. And where the last company provided an early exit opportunity, this one too provided that initially to some investors that came in. But it was a very different company in terms of the life cycle of the business. So in this case, this was much more of a later stage opportunity. If you're not familiar with PharmaJet, they're based in Colorado. They've developed devices that are needle-free vaccine delivery devices. And they have two that are shown on the screen there that are FDA approved, different depths of tissue that it can deliver vaccines to. And there's a lot of different value proposition here that this brings as a set of devices. But a couple things I'll call out is just that it takes a vaccine that can be very expensive, say like polio, and it can really optimize the use of every drop of that vaccine because it goes right into specific parts of the tissue compared to traditional, needles that often are wasting a good percentage of the vaccine. So as we move into things like the COVID-19 vaccine, this company's working with a number of partners on collaboration to hopefully be one of the delivery mechanisms. So if you go to the next slide, Peter, the value here to investors, what attracted folks was, again, this is a little bit of an odd deal for an angel investor. When they first came to RVC, it was their Series E round, as in they went A, B, C, D, and they were at E. And generally, as angel investors, early VCs were coming in at seed, maybe seed 2, maybe Series A. So these later in the alphabet opportunities are unique. But what was exciting here is the proximity to exit made sense. So while we were coming in at a high valuation, the fact that we could be experiencing a liquidity event when we first invested in a short order that was attractive to folks. So again, this comes back to exit strategy. These guys were also post FDA, so the regulatory hurdles had been sort of mitigated at that point. That too was unique, and then of course in revenue. And then they built, over years of work and capital raise, they built a really impressive intellectual property portfolio, something that again becomes valuable at exit. So this is something that all investors are really strong management team, very professional team, again, malleable, but also had the experience in this case where there was a lot of trust built in that team. And then, the last thing which I find is important in each one of these life science deals, but maybe isn't always, front and center, is just the social impact that this company's creating by just going out and doing what they're doing. They've partnered with the World Health Organization on this polio eradication project, and they've deployed flu vaccines across the developing world. And they're making a major impact by being an easy to use device that can maximize these vaccines and help eradicate disease. That makes a difference to investors. They may not always say that's the reason, but the fact that that's a part of this, I've observed is a major factor. Not to mention that it has financial potential. So it's not all about the impact, but that plays a role. All right, and then just the last one here was another recent investment, a Denver-based company called Nimble Science. And this one, the first two being medical devices, this one falling more into the digital health category that Peter talked about at the beginning. And the problem that this company is addressing is related to falls in older adults. 1 in 4 adults aged 65 or older will have a fall, and those falls often have terrible implications thereafter, surgeries, poor quality of life, and even worse. So what they've done is they've developed a solution over time that's a digital balance training program. And their mission, as you see here, is to prevent 1 million falls. So they utilize a mix of physical exercise with cognitive exercises, all designed to improve balance. And so they're training the body and the mind to effectively work together. So if you go to the next slide, please, Peter. The things that kind of stood out here, again, the team, I think, was front and center here, where they were certainly malleable. They were also an experienced team, and one that had a proven track record in the digital health world. So founders have had exits in this space previously. That's something that always stands out to investors. And they were individually impressive, but the fact that they were working together as one collective, that was one strength. They had multiple channel strategies. So they're both going through senior living facilities where there's a large collection of elderly individuals who need these balance training programs, but also through payers. And so that's this payer strategy and traction. And if you're not familiar, the payers are often the folks that are paying for medical service, and most often these are insurance companies. So, Aetna, United Health, Cigna, folks like that. And, these are major players in the healthcare ecosystem and can be really valuable as clients and channel partners to digital health companies, but they can be extremely long sales cycles. Be really hard and difficult long and hard to get them to sign up as paying customers. You often have to spend a long time just getting to a first pilot that's often unpaid. Then you have to take the time to prove the value. Then maybe 2 years down the road, it translates into a contract. In this case, what was very impressive to investors who knew how difficult their approach can be was just the pace at which they were able to close on payer contracts, and they continue to do that. That really stood out. And then the number of overall covered lives that they then have as a result of going through these large networks like a Kaiser was really significant. So that was a major factor for folks coming in. The blue ocean component really has to do with competition, where a red ocean is, there's blood in the water and there's a lot of competitors out there. In this case, for this purpose, there were very few, and very few that had this kind of approach that Nimble does. And so that was attractive to investors as well. And then lastly here, just like with PharmaJet, the social impact, the mission component of this, I think ultimately becomes a factor in making that investment decision and ultimately how you champion a company as an investor. So those are just 3 examples, and you kind of see they're all unique, but they all shared some commonality in that time is an important factor for any life science deal, and each of these has an interesting approach to time, whether it be exit strategy or their customer acquisition strategy and just the traction they've shown to date. Regulatory paths also being a function of time, of course, and so that on-ramp point was really important for the first two companies, and then for this one, just the pace at which they were selling. And then, of course, the impact and the mission. And then I think just the balance of these teams is really what stood out. And that makes these 3 kind of connected in some way. So again, for the folks on the call that may be investors in some of these companies, were there other things that stood out to you, maybe individually or just as life science investors, stand out to you when you're looking at these deals and things that are, positives to you? Anybody want to shout out? Otherwise,
I'll just add one. These you look at a lot of life science deals, and it's sometimes hard to imagine how the industry is going to react to these things. And these 3 companies all have had really good adoption by the industry. Well, I guess maybe not Spinal Line yet, but they will. But there's things that are sort of surprises, at least for me. I was a big fan of PharmaJet all along, and I was thinking about the revenue models and how they create value. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I figured out that they have about 92 drugs that are currently going through the FDA process that are using the PharmaJet system as the delivery during their clinical trials. Now, what that means is once these drugs are approved, they can only be delivered using the PharmaJet system. And it makes sense, especially for like RNA-based drugs that need to pierce the cells, that PharmaJet would be actually more effective than hypodermic needles. But when you think that the way PharmaJet has negotiated these deals, they get a percentage of revenue on each of these drugs. And obviously not all 92 of these will be approved, but the revenue potential from the profit sharing on the drug sales could be, even greater than the revenues from selling their single dose systems. So interesting things like that. Dave Jaraco.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Dave, to your question of what is maybe a commonality or what was some elements of investability that wasn't brought up, I think for me, the classic failure mode in healthcare technology are the best ideas that require change to the workflow. I think quite oftentimes we think in healthcare, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. And it's really far from that being the case. So if you look at Spinal Lines' proposed solution, PharmaJet's, let's say, existing solution, and the way Nimble is going to market with their solution, they all fit into the delivery of care workflow. I'm going to take the most obvious one first, which is PharmaJet, which is you put it in someone's hand, you pop it on the shoulder, and they get to go on down the line, right? That one could argue is a simplification of the existing workflow in terms of de-skilling practitioners. If you take Spinal Line, the reason why measurements aren't happening today is because it doesn't fit in the workflow to bring in all these radiographic imaging devices to slow down the surgery, right? Everyone knows you should measure, but no one wants to slow down how they do their surgery. Solve that problem. If you look at Nimble in terms of, let's say, the multitasking, dual tasking exercise, you no longer have to get seniors on buses to go somewhere. This is something where you can do at the site, right? So if you look at what drives adoption in the healthcare places, it is that kind of fitting into how the process exists.
Great point. I'll point out, by the way, you can type questions in on the chat too, if you like. And there's one that came in on the chat, and it was just talking about how RVC structures some of these deals and what the investments look like. So I'll just say, usually when we're looking at these early stage deals, the raises are small. They're like 500,000 to 1.5 million on average. And each investor in RVC typically, the bell curve is somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 per investor per deal, and it's up to you. And because we can only do that because of the way we structure these single purpose vehicles that we put these deals together with. But there was a question also about the fund and how that would work. And I did skip over it at the beginning, I apologize, but we are now open for the Rockies Vintage Fund. And what the Vintage Fund is an opportunity for investors to make a single investment in a portfolio of the 25-ish deals that we expect to do in 2021. And the minimum for that would be $25,000. So you'd have roughly pro rata about $1,000 in each of the 25-ish deals we do next year. Of those, probably 8-ish, just historically, would be life science companies. So we're giving investors two ways to get in: one, to get that diversification through a fund, and then the other is just on the one-off. And of course, some people could do both. You can double down on the ones you like. And follow-up question just came through on the fund and what the management fee is. And for people who are not RVC members, it's a traditional 2 and 20 fund. For RVC members, we cut that carry in half, and it's a 10% carry. It's a long silence. Sibylla asks if RVC is looking at convertible notes. And I don't know if she's just tossing me this because she knows how I feel about it, but we do, out of those 25, we do maybe 2 convertible notes a year, and that number has decreased every single year. So we will do them, but there are a number of reasons why we prefer to do equity deals. And the primary one from the investor side is we can use the Section 1202 tax breaks to get up to 10x tax-free returns on the investment. And we can only do that with equity deals and not with convertible notes or safes. And then from the entrepreneur side, if you do a $1 million note at 8% for 2 years, that's $160,000 worth of dilution. And we would rather see founders keeping their stock and having enough dry powder to do sufficient raises to really make the company all it could be. So founders, we don't want to take away all that equity from that interest that's accruing, and investors, we would prefer to not pay 22.7% tax. So if we look at 2 deals, an equity deal is 22.7% better than a convertible note deal, just because we'll get that much more return and we don't have to pay tax. Oh, and Emily points out, this went to everybody, but I'll just point it out. We do have a deep dive coming up on the Rockies Vintage Fund, and we'll have a brief presentation, and then you can ask all the questions you want about how it works and what the mechanics are of that. And that's coming up, and she's got a link for you in the chat.
Hey, Peter, one question that came up was around when's the right time to engage with RVC or really with angel investors if you're a life sciences company. And I think I'm assuming the question is related to stage, like how much traction is enough traction to engage. And so I'll just say that it depends, but in general, we like to think about things in life sciences as a function of proximity to exit. So that's where typically we'll say like a class 2 device, if you're going through that regulatory path, we're typically coming in maybe year 2 of the company. And those first 2 years have been funded typically to date by grant funding, non-dilutive capital. And then you're really seeking that first outside private investment when you're somewhat along the way towards FDA clearance if you're going that route. And then the reason being its proximity to exit is because it's justifiable that if you're 2 years in, that maybe you'd be exiting in year 7 of the company, which would be year 5 of our investment. And that's kind of syncs up with our timeline. So it's the general answer is it's typically later than your average tech company, which we may invest in, say, year 1. So a lot of that depends on your regulatory strategy and really your exit strategy.
So we had another question come in about for individual deals versus the fund, how is RVC paid for managing the deal flow? And a couple of answers to that is just to back up and talk about how a deal happens. So if you think we have 200 investors, we pitch deals every single month. We narrow down to the ones that are going to move ahead that typically need to have at least a dozen people following and a lead investor. So that sort of forms a team around a particular deal. And then the first thing that lead investor will do is work with Kevin Kudra, who manages our due diligence teams, and they will identify the key risks and work out a program for doing due diligence, which will typically take about 3 weeks. So knowing all of that, now answering the question about how RVC is compensated for all of that, there is a 10% carry on these SPVs. And if you don't know, a carry is a percentage of the profits interest. So if we put in, $500,000 into a deal and we got $5 million back, then there would be $450,000 carried interest on that 10% of the profit. All right. Yeah. And that is shared with the lead investor, the due diligence team, and RVC. So that's sort of the compensation model on that side. On the other side, we're a nonprofit, so we're not charging giant fees up front. There is a small fee for each deal that we use to pay our accountants to do the K-1s and tax returns for the SPVs and manage that part of it. But that's fairly minimal. I'll just point out, by the way, that somebody was asking about this the other day. One of the main advantages of doing the SPVs is it gives us enough negotiating leverage that we can actually structure most of our deals, 23 out of 25, to be Section 1202 tax exempt. So about half of the deals coming in the startup world are convertible notes. And so we're able to actually negotiate these deals so that we're not paying taxes on them. So that's a additional benefit of that structure.
Yeah, one last thing, just since we love to close out on taxes because we know how to close strong. For the Colorado-based life science entrepreneurs on the call, if you're not aware of the tax credit, there's a state tax credit that can be awarded to advanced industries companies. And if you're a bioscience company or a healthcare company, you're going to be an advanced industry according to the state of Colorado. So it's a really simple process. You can apply for it anytime. It takes like 15, 20 minutes. And then typically within a couple of weeks, the state will let you know you've been approved. And what that means is when you're going to raise capital, when you're providing your ask to investors, you can say, we're raising $1 million and we have this 25% state income tax credit. So Colorado investors can take advantage of that and get a tax credit on their investment. So it's really attractive, and it's a way to kind of sweeten the deal a little bit. It resets every year, so it taps out. There's a fixed amount of capital. It taps out usually April, May every year. So if you're just kicking off a raise now and you're maybe thinking January is a good time to close, the idea is get approved for that credit and then offer that up to investors as you're pitching. And then come January, when they might write a check, they can take advantage of that credit. So it's a good strategic thing to do on top of, everything else that you're doing with your fundraise.
And those 25% tax credits, by the way, flow up both through the SPVs and through the fund. So each member of the fund is issued a pro rata tax credit that they can use.
Yeah. And I know there's some folks from out of state. I see somebody from Minnesota, Michigan. So I know each state has versions of this. I just bring up the Colorado one because it's obviously what we know well. But take a look at it wherever you're based. I'm sure there's a version of that wherever you're located. All right, well, we're 2 minutes to the hour here. Any last questions for the team here or for anyone else? Or any insights? You really want to have the last word be about taxes? That's on you. Yeah, I'll call this out. Tom brought up Peter had a great birthday this week on Tuesday. So happy birthday, Peter.
39 again.
Turned 39 like Jack Benny. I don't know, that's an old reference. I don't know what that means. But happy birthday.
Thanks, Dave.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This is great. Hope to see the investors on the call at the Life Sciences Investor Forum next Wednesday. Really, anybody interested in investing that's an investor at the Alt Chapter Forum on Tuesday. And hope everybody stays well and has a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.